I'd like to welcome everyone to the third in our series of risk and regulation webinars, which today focuses on competency. This webinar is hosted in association with product safety specialist UL International. I am Thomas Lane, the technical editor of Building Magazine. In her report following the Grenfell Tower disaster, Dame Judith Hackett identified serious shortcomings in the competency of many of those responsible for design and construction. These shortcomings include a lack of formal training in any formal qualifications and a fragmented approach to competency, with people focusing on their individual specialism without giving due consideration to how their work may interact with the work of others, and a failure to see the building as a single entity or system. The Competence Steering Group was set up to address these shortcomings and has developed a competence framework covering 12 areas, ranging from designers to installers and products. The British Standards Institute is now developing a new suite of standards, including an overarching competence framework and standards focusing specifically on principal designers, principal contractors, and building safety managers. The overarching framework standard is currently out for consultation. Today, we will be looking at detail in the competence challenge, including skill levels and training, the competency standards, and how to embed the necessary changes successfully across the industry. Today, I'm joined by a panel of 6 experts. So we have Peter Capehorn, who is the Chief Executive of the Construction Products Association, Richard Harrell, who is the technical author of the overarching competence framework standards for the BSI, Andrew Meller, who is a partner at Architect PRP, Simon Ince, project engineer at UL International, David Fries, who is a Group Chief Executive Officer of the Building Engineering Services Association, and Julie Brugella, who is the Technical Director of Assurance at BRE Group. So we're going to kick off now with Peter, but just before Peter starts, I'd like to encourage everybody here who is listening today to submit any questions that you have, and then once everyone has presented, we will then do a Q&A session and we'll be answering your questions. So please do feel free to answer a question. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Peter. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thomas, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to take part today. So I think for many people around the industry, a key issue is the balance of risk and regulation. And what does that actually mean? Well, I'd just like to give some sort of scene setting and background positions. So why did we get to this particular point? And it was laid bare clearly in the disaster at Grenfell Tower. There's a whole issue that has happened, I believe, over the last 20, maybe 30 years across the industry, where we have seen custom and practice. We have seen a push towards fastest and cheapest that has driven how people have to behave. At the same time, we've seen a reduction in oversight, as I would call it, a reduction of anybody checking and making sure that what we have produced in the building is actually what we wanted. So this dilution of the core essence of how we are behaving has borne greater risk, greater challenge in terms of how the building performs. And that led us, unfortunately, I believe, to what we have seen in recent times. And, you know, we also, at the same time, unfortunately, as we had Grenfell, we had the Scottish schools problems, and prior to that, several notable events across the industry. And, you know, clearly this has not been limited entirely to the UK. There have been issues all around the world that have caused people to sit up and rethink how their industry is behaving and how things are working. Now, At the heart of this, it is managing risk and managing how activities are undertaken right across the whole industry. So what does that boil down to? It does boil down to competence, but it also boils down to a wider understanding. So I would say we need to bring into this conversation not just straight competence, but also the ability to interact, the ability to have collaboration between everybody involved in any particular team. And again, I would widen that out also to those people managing buildings and ensuring that during the occupational stage of a building, everything is done as it should be. We see continually evidence that maintenance has a big part to play in whether buildings are safe or not, and whether the risk of day-to-day operations from a building are properly managed. We also see clear evidence in terms of when maintenance is done, as it obviously needs to be, is that maintenance ensuring that the performance of the building continues as it is intended. We've got really good examples where pursuing one part of an agenda, for instance, reducing energy consumption, actually makes a building vulnerable to other parts of the spectrum, making a challenge for people in terms of either accessibility or fire performance or other characteristics. So clearly we have to move forward with competence that is addressing all of the issues, competence that actually ensures that people can be relied upon to actually deliver a proper service, to ensure that people are competent in understanding what they're doing and the effects of getting it wrong. And equally, for my part, competence that says, I know how far to go, I know where my limits are, and making sure that I don't step beyond them. And if I need to have some sort of conversation about work that will go beyond my competence, I need to engage somebody else who has got that ability to take things forward. Now, we see, and hopefully we're going to have a chat about this with others on the panel a bit later, how this work has developed, how we have moved through the analysis that Dame Judith Hackett produced to the Building Safety Programme and recently to the publication of the draft bill. All of that sets the scene very well for taking things forward. But I think it is so important that industry recognises that change is coming. And so this is a new world of greater responsibility, of duties, of sanctions when people get things wrong. It's also a new world of ensuring that we as an industry come together and produce buildings that actually perform. They deliver what the original brief was supposed to deliver, and they provably do that. I think a key factor in all the conversation about competence is the fact that you need not just to be competent, but you need actually to prove that you are competent, and more or less on a day-to-day basis. We need to establish a new bar, and in fact the report that's coming out very shortly that industry has been working on, that Thomas referred to, that is about setting the bar for the industry. And whilst there are many parts of the industry that haven't yet engaged with all those elements that have been discussed, it's a key and fundamental change for the industry to take on. And I want to move beyond the principle of custom and practice. I want to move beyond how we've currently seen and analysed the current problems of the industry to a point where we get to actually building respect again for the work that the construction industry can do. We have a few challenges down the road. Clearly, we are about to just move into all the ramifications of Brexit. And for the next couple of years, we will see various issues that will confront industry. At the same time as upping the game on competence and reducing risk. And of course, we've just all started to emerge from this really bad pandemic and all the issues that have affected industry through that period. So I think, in summary, we have got some real challenges. We have also got some really good work that we've got under our belt that takes us forward into a new period. we still need to confront the issues of contract and procurement, and we wait in anticipation to see how the new product regulator and the Office of Product Safety actually comes to bear on some of the fundamentals around the essentials of where we're intending to go. But fundamentally, this is a topic that's front and center, and it's for everybody to play their part and pay attention to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Peter. Before we move on to the next presenter, just wanted to get an update from you really on the work that you're doing as part of one of the 12 competence groups, because I understand you were going to be preparing a draft code of conduct for manufacturers, all in the with the goal of sort of making sure that product information was consistent, clear and transparent. How is that work going, Peter?
Thanks, Thomas. It is going very well. This is outside of the main competence work. We've got two work streams to this. So one is about the competent use of products, which is within the raising the bar remit. But outside of that, we decided to take on Dame Judith's challenge about product information. Towards the end of this year, we'll be launching for consultation a draft code that we hope everybody across the industry will want to sign up to. And then what that code will do is to declare that product manufacturer is producing information that is clear, robust, provable and transparent. So hopefully providing consistency and confidence to anybody who uses that information. So it's a bit like the ABDA scheme in terms of people buying into and agreeing to comply with the code. And as I say, that's out for consultation towards the end of the year. We hope next year we will be creating a body to actually run it for the industry.
I see, thank you. And when it comes to the competence of installing products, which is clearly a pretty key area, I mean, what is your work involved there, and how are you getting on with that?
Okay, so that is taking us a little bit longer. So we agreed that our report on that would be coming out in November, and what we are producing there is a matrix which it provides the whole of industry with a target level of competence. So for all actors across the industry, from clients through consultants through contractors and installers, and in terms of the stage of the project, we are setting a clear principle of how much knowledge and experience is needed for that particular person, for that particular stage of the project. And we hope again that sets the framework to ensure confidence over how people address products and apply them correctly in any particular part in the process.
Great, well, thank you very much, Peter. So we're now going to turn to our next speaker, who is Richard Harrell, who is working with the BSI on the overarching competence framework, and he's going to tell you all about it. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Thomas. So I'm going to talk through for about 8 to 10 minutes. I'm going to run through very quickly the fundamentals of the new BSI Flex 8670, which is snappily titled Built Environment Overarching Framework for Competence of Individuals Specification. And the first thing I would note is that the title is very specifically worded. This is a framework for competence of individuals, and one of the easiest ways to really understand how it's intended to work is to think about it in that way. It's not a competence framework in itself. You wouldn't assess an individual against this. You'd assess competence frameworks against it. So it's the framework that we want to use as an initial building block for work that's flowing from the CSG, and of course the independent review of building regulations and building safety. So firstly, I think just very briefly, as has been mentioned, this work builds on work undertaken by the Competence Steering Group. So this is very much about an industry-led, industry collaborative approach being turned into a British standard. I worked as technical director for the Chartered Association Building Engineers on 3 competence working groups, building control engineers and architects and building designers, and also interacted with 2 or 3 of the others. And that was one of being able to see across a range of groups was one of the drivers for supporting standardization in this form to drive commonality. So this is part of a very iterative, fast iterative process being led by BSI through their new Flex program, which is a rapid standards development process. Just want to stress that the consultation is absolutely there for people to feed into. We want to get people's views. We want to strengthen this. We want to make it as clear and pragmatic as possible in order that it can be used as an effective tool to kind of baseline competence across the built environment sector. So what are we trying to achieve with this standard? Well, we want to create a common approach to competence frameworks for persons working in the built environment. So it's not just higher risk buildings. The standard is developed to address those issues in part, but it's also there to create a common framework for competence across the built environment sector as a whole. We do want to set out core competence requirements for building safety on higher risk buildings. Absolutely critical that that's achieved, of course. We want to set out some structural requirements for what we call sector specific competence frameworks, so that structurally they have the right components to deliver the outcomes. We want to introduce common competence requirements for behaviour and ethics across the sector as a whole. Again, baselining and starting to outline the nature of the culture change that government and the industry want to see us all go through. And this is very much based around the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviour framework that I'll explain a bit more later. We want to drive common language and understanding, so actually using this standard to break down some of the silo behaviours in the industry, and also to provide some baseline information around the principles of competence, but also around key building safety risks, including fire safety, structural safety and public health in higher risk buildings, so that there's a shared fundamental understanding of the scope of issues that need to be looked at. As I said earlier, the key to understanding this is that it's a framework for sector-specific competence frameworks rather than the competence framework itself. It's not intended to supersede or replace existing qualification or competence frameworks. It's there to enable those to be compared. It's there to enable gap analysis and to provide a structured and consistent way for the industry committee on competence that will be set up within the building safety regulator to look at competence frameworks, assess them, but also to support people who are coming to develop competence frameworks for the first time or to upgrade their qualification and competence framework pathways. The specification doesn't set out how it will be used. That will be done in other guidance. That will be done in approved documents. Potentially the MHCLG have indicated that they intend to publish an approved document on competence, setting out how people can meet those requirements. But there will also be a suite of standards produced by BSI, as well as other statutory guidance produced by government. We think that the key to this working is the use of a mapping approach. So where people are trying to comply with a standard, we don't expect them to fully restructure their standard to reflect what is set out in the overarching framework. What we would expect them to do is to be able to explain how they've met the criteria within by mapping from their existing frameworks back onto this. So this is about pragmatic comparison and benchmarking. And critically, we think that that will work best with the comply or explain approach employed by the Committee on Industry Competence. So where things aren't relevant, you can explain, but I think the idea is that you should expect to be challenged as to why your framework or a sector-specific framework that you use varies from the core criteria set out. Content, very quickly, we're very familiar to people who are familiar with British standards and PAS documents, publicly available specifications. Section 0 provides some quite extensive context on what competence is and why it matters, describing core components of effective sector-specific frameworks, and talking about behaviour change and safety culture and ethics. Section 1 sets out the scope, and the scope for this is anyone working in the built environment, but also with specific reference to those working on higher risk buildings. Section 2 is normative references. Section 3, key terms and definitions used in the document. Section 4 sets out the requirements for structure and content of all sector specific frameworks, not just high risk buildings, but all frameworks. Section 5 looks at core behavioural and ethical competence. Again, that's for all built environment frameworks. And Section 6 sets out the requirements for shared competence when working on higher risk buildings. And these are supported by informative annexes on fire and life safety, structural safety, public health and public safety, and a glossary setting out common terms relating to safety in higher risk buildings to help drive commonality of understanding. Whilst the specification is 54 pages long, the actual compliance requirements are only 10 pages, so it sets a lot of context to drive commonality, but the actual compliance requirements should not be overwhelming. They are very manageable in terms of the mapping process. As a standard, this sets out definitions of competence, and the key takeaway from this is the difference between competence and a competency. Now, this is the language of competence frameworks that's generally accepted. Competence and competencies are the combination of skills, knowledge, experience and behaviour, and that enable an individual to make informed decisions and carry out defined functions. So we think of that as a functional level competence. It's a higher level competence, but competency and competencies are task level descriptors. So they're the more detailed competencies that we would expect to see in sector specific frameworks. And these are brought together under 4 broad headings of skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours, and that reflects the intended drafting in legislation. The PAS sets out, the Flex document sets out basic structural requirements. So these are the information components we think that most frameworks should have. I'm not going to go through them, but they're pretty sensible. If you include this information, it should enable people to engage with the frameworks very effectively and enable for their comparison effectively. And Section 5 sets out common criteria for behavioural competence. Now, these have been drawn from analysis of a whole range of other sectors, including the aeronautical sector, the aerospace sector, nuclear, some of the finance sector, but also parts of the construction sector in this country and other countries. And these are intended to start to define the behaviour change, the culture change that we want, starting to set these out. Now, the 5 key headings that are there: acting ethically and contributing to safe outcomes, leadership, teamwork and communication, individual and organisational competence, personal responsibility and accountability, and duty of care to others. These are all really pragmatic behavioural traits, but really quite groundbreaking in some ways to start to actually set out assessment against these within our sector, but absolutely critical to the culture change we want. And then we have the core competence requirements for safety in higher risk buildings, which have been developed from an analysis of all of the competence frameworks that were submitted and developed under the competence steering group's auspices. And again, there are 5 key areas: managing safety, knowledge management and communication, buildings as system and construction products, fire and life safety, and ethics. A quick word about the mapping approach. I've already described this to a degree, but what we hope will happen with this specification is that people will not just use it to develop new frameworks, but they'll use it to challenge their own frameworks, to look through all of the content in here and say, are there tools here that we can use to strengthen our frameworks? Have we identified the interfaces between our work and other sectors and other roles and other functions? If so, have we got the right competencies? Do we need to gap fill those competencies so that we work effectively across the industry as a whole? And as I said, the mapping approach we think is key to the use by the Industry Competence Committee. The informative annexes, very briefly, are there to provide a baseline common knowledge, as I said, and to help challenge siloed thinking. They are not meant to be comprehensive, but they should really help anyone fresh start to get a wider perspective on the considerations perhaps that sit out of the side of their immediate view. And there are a number of areas for further development that we're very interested in. There'll be another 2 consultations on this before March next year, I believe. So we will be kind of looking to improve and clarify text. We're interested in views as to how we can do that, the requirements for the structure and content of frameworks. We want to get the descriptors for the behavioural and core competencies on building safety right, so we're really interested in views on that. But we also know that we need to strengthen text on residents' voice and consultation with building occupants, and that's one of the kind of remaining areas where we really need to strengthen this. Finally, trying to actually strengthen, review and develop the common terminology and language so that we have a genuinely shared understanding across the sector. Please, these consultation is out on the BSI website if you want to go there and look under built environment competence. You'll find all of the information you need, and we are really keen to engage and develop this into something that provides a very sound footing for what is going to be a big journey for the sector as a whole, but one that promises to deliver some real benefits. So I'll end there and hand back over to Thomas.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Richard, for that really informative presentation. Really sort of sets out what's going to be in the standard. So really in terms of timing, when do you think that the overarching competency framework will be ready? And is it the case that this first standard needs to be finalised before work can start on the standards covering the principal, designer, contractor and building safety managers?
So this standard, the Flex standard, will be published in the final form in March next year, but it'll immediately go into a full British standards process. So it'll be usable at that point, but it'll then go into a further refinement process over a period of months after that to turn it into a full British standard. I think that the timetable for development of the other duty holding roles and the building safety manager role, so the principal designer, principal contractor and building safety manager, they're scheduled to start in earnest in March next year. There's a research and development project happening before that to start to lay the ground. And I know that there are discussions ongoing. The building safety manager framework team are very keen to move fast on that if possible, but that's the timetable at the moment, which would see those duty holding frameworks and this Flex standard all translated, I think, into British standards by kind of March 2022. So it's 12 to 18 months. We'll start to really see the shape of this suite of documents that will underpin the new duty holding frameworks.
Great, well, thank you very much. So we're now going to move on to our next presenter, who is Andrew Meller, who is an architect, a partner at PRP. So thanks very much, and over to you, Andrew. And Rich, if you could just stop sharing your screen, that's brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom. No slides from me, which is unusual for an architect. We are in a rapidly changing period of legislation and related guidance, and keeping up with it is extremely difficult and will be even more so over the coming years. For those of us that work on this legislation development, it's difficult for us, but for those who are not involved, it must be extremely difficult at the moment. Proposed new or amended legislation, of course, includes the Building Safety Act, all the supporting secondary legislation that's going to sit with that, and as we've heard, some of the competence standards and related guidance, the Fire Safety Act and changes to the Fire Safety Order, but also, in addition to that, approximately 50% of the approved documents sitting against the building regulations will be planned to be changed in the coming months and years. And that includes approved document B, fire safety, F, ventilation, L, thermal performance, M on access, and P on electrical safety. We've had 3 versions of ADB in the last 20 months, but we know that there are at least 2 others to come in the next 2 years, and probably 1 in the next 3 to 6 months, certainly, because it's being consulted on at the moment. With all this change, it's going to be very difficult for us to keep up and maintain full knowledge and understanding of all the requirements. The Building Safety Act includes a particular requirement related to architects, and that's the requirement for the Architects Registration Board to ensure that the competency of architects is maintained. So we will likely see more formal continuing professional development and competency checks being introduced by ARB over the coming years, following consultation process with its members, which is undertaking currently. The RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, has required its members to undertake CPD for as long as I can remember in any case. And of course, therefore, architects who are not chartered architects may not be undertaking CPD currently. And I think that's an important consideration and partly why the requirement for the ARB has been brought in through the Building Safety Act. It is, in my opinion, right to have such competency assessments, but they need to be well considered. For example, an architect with 5 years post-qualification experience going through his first RIBA validation or revalidation examination may not have the same competency levels as one with 20 or more years experience. So the assessments need to take this into account in some way. CPD products from manufacturers, seminars and such are of course extremely important for us to understand the performance on our products and what's on the market. But CPD is going to have to be more structured, in my opinion, and certainly from the start of this new legislative regime, it's going to have to focus on health and safety, legislation and what that means, and all the changing legislation, so it's constant change, commercial practice, and arguably I think this is probably more important at the outset than product CPD. Small practices, any part of the built environment sector may well find it hard to ensure that their employees obtain all the required CPD given the time commitments and expense this is going to cost. Training will definitely have to be structured and in part formal to ensure we're getting the right knowledge required for our individual roles. But of course, competency is not just about skills, knowledge and expertise of individuals, but the management procedures and processes that the business puts in place too. Since Grenfell at PRP, we've been working extremely hard at senior level, driving down from the top and actively promoting best practice behaviours. And we've practically sought ways of improving our processes related to ensuring building safety, as many organisations have. At PRP, we've developed a fire safety audit tool, which considers every single part of the approved document B guidance. And we use this to undertake a fire safety audit on every project in the practice. The audit considers requirements outside of ADB and anticipates changing legislation. It will also always therefore be a live tool which evolves as legislation does. Processes such as this fire safety audit has given our PI insurers confidence that we are competent and we are taking matters very seriously. At a time when PI insurance is becoming increasingly difficult to obtain, and particularly in relation to safety cover. The new principal designer role under the Building Safety Act requires the PD to coordinate, monitor and manage the pre-construction phase and coordinate building safety matters to ensure that the project complies with the building regulations. Well, in my opinion, that is not an individual. It's not the PD, principal designer who looks after health and safety under the current CDM requirements. And also this principal designer has to co-sign the final declaration with the client and the principal contractor to say to the best of their knowledge, this building that they have been involved with meets the building regulations. Who is going to have the competency for this role, which comes with commercial risks and sanctions for non-compliance? In my opinion, this principal designer is not an individual, but it's a multidisciplinary team which can validate the building design compliance with the regulations. It's an architect, it's a structural engineer, it's an M&E engineer. It might even be a former building inspector in the team as well. Only if we have that in place can I see that PI insurers are going to actually insure us to undertake this role in the profession. Will insurers therefore provide cover for the PD role when they're becoming more and more risk averse and shying away from the construction industry? This remains to be seen, and I don't think the insurance industry has been engaged with enough as yet. When we come down, not just about competency, but about the numbers of individuals in the industry, and we're undertaking a piece of work for MHCLG at the moment looking at exactly that. How many fire risk assessors are there? How many potential building safety managers are there? How many principal designers might be under the NOVA regime? Well, I think the answer is we need many more of all of those with the relevant levels of competency. So what is clear, and I think finally from me, is that to deliver as an industry, we are therefore going to have to actively support the training of young people, those already in the professions and outside of the professions as they come through colleges and construction colleges, upskill many already in the industry, and for others, it will mean diversifying their skills to take on new and expanded roles. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Andrew. Before we move on to the next question, I mean, you mentioned taking on the role of overseeing competency in the architectural profession, as referenced in in all the legislation, proposed legislation we've seen. And also, as you alluded to, revalidation, the RIBA is proposing that a 5-year revalidation as a condition of its membership. Do you get a sense that these two organisations are actually talking to each other, and there's going to be a joint approach to competence coming out of both?
I don't know for definite whether they are, but I should imagine, to be honest, that they're not. Of course, we'd like to see that as architects in the profession. We don't necessarily want to be taking 2 exams. We would hope, one validation process would allow us to go through the process for both organisations.
Sure, I completely understand. Yeah. And I've got a question actually, which I will put to you now, because it sort of again it alludes to what you were talking about earlier about PI insurance. So the question really is, and I was thinking really your point about the principal designer being a collective of professionals, structural engineers and so on and so forth, not just necessarily the architect. So the question is how do we stop the drive for competence becoming a paper chasing exercise and risk aversion, which I think would apply to a whole team. When if something did go wrong, you can imagine that team, okay, they are the principal design, but within that team you can sort of see risk compartment, people trying to pass on risk. Do you see that as an issue?
Yeah, of course, it's definitely going to be an issue, but I think you've probably got the principal designer, which is an individual who's managing that process, and therefore you've got a team under them. I don't think anyone in today's construction industry can have that level of expertise across those professions. And of course, this role is yet to be defined, and Richard talks about that being defined under the PAS. But however the competency is for the role, the need to sign off that the building is compliant with the building regulations, I can't see any organisation or their insurers allowing one individual to do that without having great oversight of different parts of the building process and construction process on site.
Right. I mean, that is going to be a huge challenge, which maybe we'll pick up in the discussion once everyone's spoken. But for now, thanks very much, Andrew. And we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Simon Ince, who is from UL International. So over to you, Simon. Simon, are you there?
Sorry, yeah, I am. I'm just trying to share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. Have you got that on the screen?
I can't see. No. Yes, I can.
It should be coming up. Yes, really there we go.
Thank you.
No worries. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I've loosely entitled my presentation "Managing the Culture Change," and I think already the topic of competence is huge, and all the presenters are coming at it from different angles. So I've learned quite a bit today already, which is good. UL is over 125 years old. It was founded in the US, and our mission today remains the same as it was when it was first started. And we're working for a safer world. So I think CPD events like this actually fit in with our remit, and we're delighted to be able to respond to this today, and I'm delighted to be able to contribute to it as well. UL is now a global company, although it started in the US. We've got customers in over 140 countries. We've got 170 testing and certification centers, 11,600 employees in 40 different countries. And our specialism is working in the built environment. So hopefully we've got a broad base of experience and knowledge and understanding to contribute to today. I'd like to take you back before before Grenfell, to Lacanau House in 2009. And this, some people see as a missed opportunity, to be honest. if you see the bit that's highlighted at the bottom, this is from Colin Todd, and talking about the competence of those engaged in design, installation, maintenance, refurbishment, and subsequent assessment of fire precautions, whether active, passive, or managerial, is paramount. So it was obvious from that tragedy that things needed to change, and I don't think we actually really embraced that and moved forward very far. Then we move forward, obviously, Grenfell and the Hackett report, and I think the first sentence here, I'd like to change that first sentence if I'm honest, and I'd like to take out that section there, high rise and complex, and it should read, the current regulatory system for ensuring fire safety in buildings is not fit for purpose. The reason I want to change that sentence is from first-hand experience. I did 4 years as a risk assessor, fire risk assessor, going into buildings, various buildings, care homes, housing, commercial buildings, and I can honestly say I can't remember one building that was compliant. One, you know, I'd say 95% had significant issues. So there is definitely an issue which I've seen firsthand. Also in the Hackett review goes on to talk about this culture, and Dame Judith herself actually goes on to say we need a culture change. So, and it's very difficult to change culture. We all know that. It takes years and years to change that culture. And she says you need to care. You need to care about the buildings, you need to care about the people that live in them. And with this caveat at the bottom, until you care, the system will not change and will not work. So that got me thinking, is caring part of competence? Well, there's a couple of groups that have been working on this. The first one is Competence Steering Group, and they describe competence as SAKE, skills, attitude, knowledge, experience. So attitude is obviously, if you've got a caring attitude, it is involved in that. And they've applied that SAKE principle to all these different professions that revolve around the built environment. And if you go forward to the BSI work and the FLEX project, they describe it as SCEB, which you've already talked about, skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours, where you can have caring behaviours. And obviously their focus is on overarching competent frameworks and principal designer, principal contractor, and building safety manager, those roles. So, sorry, gone too far. Will competence change the culture? I think competence will contribute to changing the culture, but I wouldn't thought it's a fast fix. As I said, it takes a long time to change that culture, so possibly it will change it. I'd like to rephrase the question. What will change a culture? So what will change culture? And I think I'd like to put that out to the audience, see if they can think about that for a second. And then once you've thought about that, if you can put your answer on a postcard to Mr. Jenrick, Care of the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, actually don't waste a stamp, because it's already been decided. The bill's actually going through Parliament now. And I think that's what will change culture, is regulation and enforcement. Regulation, this is what you need to do. And enforcement, if you don't do it, we will punish you for that. And I think that's what the fundamentals of the bill are. I think it's very prescriptive. It's very, you know, you will do, and if you don't do, we will stop you. So what does the regulation stop? Well, we're talking about buildings in scope. And if you look at this building, it's not in scope. It's below the 18 meters of height. Currently, the government said we could actually include more buildings in the scope, but if you read it carefully, it does have a specific limit. It's residential, multi-occupied buildings above 18 meters or 6 floors. So this one's not in scope. This one, if you put a duplex penthouse on top and extend it, it actually becomes in scope. So there's very little difference between the two, to be honest. So what we're just saying is, because we've gone up slightly higher, this is high risk, and there are higher standards applied. So the safety case applies, for example, you have to have a building safety manager, you have to gateways to go through, principal designer, principal contractor, all the information about the building has to be digitized, submitted, it's being reviewed by a new regulatory body. So what we're actually doing is creating a 2-tier system. Now, as soon as you create a 2-tier system, what happens to the competent people? Which tier do they work in? So if all the competent people are rising up to the top and going into the tier 1, what happens in tier 2? And in fact, the building regulations have changed recently, and they're putting sprinklers in buildings over 11 meters So there could actually be 3 tiers. And tier 3 is absolutely, I can't see very much difference between that. Now, obviously, we all hope that competence will filter down through the system, but that graphic is fairly good, I think, in demonstrating the problems that could occur. Why is that such an important issue? Well, this is a fire from last year, Beachmere Retirement Home. So it's not a care home, it's a retirement complex. So people over 55 move into a complex. It is actually 4 floors, but predominantly it's 3 floors. There we can see the actual fire occurring. And if we look at the final slide, which is, it's devastating. That's what's left of the property. So that building wouldn't be classed as high risk at the moment if it was rebuilt. 150 people got evacuated from there, and I've listened to a presentation from one of the senior fire officers that was there that day, and they said it was very, very lucky that everyone got out. Now the trouble with relying on luck is that it runs out. We know it runs out, and we know we can't afford to have fires like this in the future. So buildings that are not in scope currently, I hope they do change the regulation to include some of these. We've obviously got detention accommodation, care homes, hospitals, student accommodation, and some modern methods of construction. So buildings that are below the height, but actually built modular or lightweight timber frame, they could be classed as high risk as well. So moving on, managing the change. What do we do with the guidance, criteria, and specifications when we get them? So this is the area that I'd like to look at. The first thing we're going to get is, as we said before, the overarching competence framework. So that framework is then going to be used for these kind of people, building standards professionals, fire safety enforcement officers, fire risk assessors, engineers. So their overarching bodies will then start to look at the competencies in the framework and how do they define competence amongst those. But this is interesting from the Building a Safer Future. Despite many who demonstrate good practices, the means of assessing and ensuring competence of key people throughout the system is inadequate. So what does that mean? Well, how do we confirm competence? Well, attestation of conformity, we can either have first party, where we operate to the industry best practice honestly. That's the organization saying themselves, the company saying, yeah, we do it, we follow industry practice. The second party, all our trade association members operate to industry best practice. It's in our code of conduct. So if they're a member of a trade association or a professional body, they operate to that code of conduct. You can assume that they are competent and they're following industry best practice. And then finally, the area we get involved is third-party certification. An independent expert body has confirmed they do meet industry best practice. So accredited independent certification. And the actual government have a policy on conformity assessment and accreditation in the UK, which people can look through, which is quite an interesting document. So if we take, for example, fire risk assessors, I've been involved with fire risk assessor competence for over a decade now. This is probably one of the first areas that kind of noted that was a problem and decided to do something about it. They got together and they produced existing competence criteria for fire risk assessors. That has already been rewritten once, but I think what's going to happen now is that it's going to be rewritten again using the overarching competence framework. So it's actually just competence criteria. There isn't an actual proper framework relating to fire risk assessors, a pathway, if you like. I know there is some work going on with the IFSM relating to that. And I think that's what's going to happen next. So therefore, once that's been rewritten, existing training providers will rewrite their courses. So how do you train people up to be risk assessors? They'll rewrite those to make sure it complies to the framework and the competence criteria. Then existing competent person schemes will be rewritten to conform to the new criteria, and existing certification schemes for companies will also be rewritten as well. So SP205, for example, or the Warrington FRAC scheme will be rewritten. Also in the Building a Safer Future, this was what was very clear as well. Clarity of roles across design, construction and maintenance is poor. We know that the second part of the BSI work is looking at the principal designer, contractors and building safety managers. So it's going to be set out in a pass they're going to accelerate it through a pass system, and eventually we will have a descriptor of what those competent people should be doing, an organisation should be doing. So what's going to happen then? Well, it's going to be seen as good practice, obviously. It's a guidance document. It's going to be seen as good practice, so it'll be adopted by responsible firms. And I think they'll probably then say first party attestation, they'll say, yes, we follow industry best practice. Of course you would. And possibly second party attestation through professional trade memberships. So they will then say we are a member of REBA, for example, and therefore we do follow best practice. So I think that's how that part is going to go. So for the second part, the third one, building safety manager, I think that might be slightly different. I think because it could be an individual, depending on the circumstances, or it could be a company that provides a service across multiple buildings. I think there'll be some kind of national qualification. So we'll go down that route. Possibly a third-party competent person certification scheme. There's going to be a lot of building managers out there that already have lots of experience and knowledge, been doing their job for years or a job like it for years, and therefore they could go down the third-party competent person route. Or as there's companies involved, we could go down the third-party quality assurance certification scheme route. So actually the management systems going in and auditing independently that company that provide that service. Have they got competent people? Are they doing a good job? So finally, competence is not a demonstration that what is being supplied meets the requirements. So just because you are competent, you know, the culture we've talked about, culture issues, time pressures, money pressures, you know, drive to the bottom, all those things are going to take time to actually change. And that quote in the middle there is from the document I mentioned, the government document on conformity assessment. And I'll leave you to read that. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, well, thanks very much, Simon. A quick question for you. You did touch on competent person schemes in your presentation, which have been used quite a lot over the years as a way really of getting people to self-regulate essentially through self-certification. Do you think there's a place for competent person schemes in this sort of new world really of competence and responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, competent person schemes are designed for that purpose. You know, an independent body says Joe Bloggs is competent to do this job, and it's defined. You can see from the scope of what they've actually gone through. The process is very clearly set out, and it's a nice way of individuals being able to confirm that they can do what they claim to be able to do. So for example, risk assessors, a lot of risk assessors are sole traders. So they work out of the house. They subcontract to lots of different companies and organizations. So that certificate of competence for that individual is then transferable. If you've got that, then anyone can employ you and they can say, well, this person knows what they're doing. I'm happy to employ them because they've got this third party validation. So yeah, I think competent person schemes are a great way forward for several of those, you know, fire risk assessors, building safety managers. That might be the way forward for them.
Great, well, thanks very much, Simon. So we're going to move on now to our next presenter, who is David Fries, who is the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Building Engineering Services Association. So over to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm conscious of time, so I'll crack on. If you do nothing else after today, I hope you're listening to the BBC Grenfell Inquiry podcast on BBC Sounds, because that informs much of my thinking, and I think it should inform pretty much everybody's thinking if you're in construction. Last week we launched, or last month actually, we launched a new guest or best practice design and installation guide on fire stopping of service penetrations. And we did that because there was a definitive need for it, and over 2,000, I think probably over 3,000 copies have now been downloaded. We're doing a webinar tomorrow and over 350 people have signed up. So there's obviously a demand for this and a need for this guide, and it's free to the industry. But I was very depressed when I spoke to a manufacturer of proprietary fire stopping equipment later on this week, who told me his product had just been value engineered out of a project because it was too expensive and they were going to do it themselves. And what does that tell us about the industry that we work in? After the Grenfell fire, I did a tweet that said something along the lines of, we may not understand the exact causes of the fire, but we'd all recognize the culture that delivered it. And nothing I've heard in the inquiry has maybe changed my mind on that. We jokingly say in our office, and I've said it as a contractor, is that the fact you can't do a job in our industry has never stopped you winning a job in this industry. And in fact, in my last role at the FIS, which is the dry liners, the most common question that was asked in the technical helpline was, there is a British standard for this stuff? That's extraordinary, but that's the industry we're in. And also, we're all joke about, well, the biggest mistake won a tender. It always does. I hold my hand up. I once missed a whole floor off a building and won it that way. And yes, of course, we did the job. They're both common practice, however, really, and they drive behaviours and are driven by behaviours. We had Dame Judith Hackett on our webinar in June, and she was very clear about the widespread lack of leadership across the sector. Too many people waiting to be told what they needed to do, despite the fact that the regulations were going to be retrospective. And we've heard already that her reports call for culture change in the industry. But do we really need to be told that we need to modify our culture? It's as much about hearts and minds. You may not know the detail of what's coming, but you know it needs to change. Simon called it, you need to care. And I think probably the fact you're on this call means that you care, but you're the minority, remember. And at the center of that new competence framework is the word ethics, the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of activity. And I always get confused between morals and ethics. Morals is sort of societal, ethics is about the individual. Surely that's a principle that we want to uphold. The new competencies set out in that framework of skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours will mean nothing if there's not an ethical approach. However the rest is done, it won't matter. You have to believe, you have to care. That moral compass has gone missing. True north has disappeared somewhere. You've come on this because you have an understanding that things are going to change, but I would argue for the majority of the industry, and certainly my experience as a contractor now and working at the FIS and now BISA, is that for most people their future self does not exist, which is a theory that William Hazlitt, a Victorian thinker, brought in, i.e. if it's not in my face now, I'll think about it tomorrow. It's the reason I didn't iron this shirt till about an hour before I came on, because future David would do it last night. And this is future stuff. You clearly have a future self, but most people in the industry don't. So it's about winning their hearts and minds. It's about showing leadership. And each and every one of us can do that, because it won't change unless we change hearts and minds. If it's only about compliance and regulation, you'll get compliance and regulation, but people will find, when we say we're innovative, we mean we find ways to get around stuff. And we don't have to wait to be told about this change. So on that basis at BISA, we've put our money where our mouth is, or we've tried to, and we've changed our technical competence standard for membership. If you want to join BISA, you can't just pay your money and sign up. You have to do a technical competence standard, which assesses your commercial viability and your competence operationally, but also your technical standards. Now you may say actually the PQQ process does that. We're members of Build UK. We support their new PQQ, 300 questions about a company. Not a single question, however, that says, can you do the job? And we support the standard, but it's, can you do the job? Can you strangle pipe work into a plant room? Can you fit duct work into a, in the way it should go and to the right standard? Can you maintain buildings? Not one question. So we've flipped our focus completely to be, can you do the job? Because if you can prove to us you can do the job, you can become a member. And that's the difficult bit. It's always the difficult bit. If it were an easy industry, then everybody would be in it, but they can't be. If you pass that competence assessment standard, you can go into the competent person scheme, provided you meet all the criteria. So we are, hands up, we operate a competent person scheme, and we believe they're a good way of actually doing that, provided you take ownership. So the CPS is about the companies. It should be renamed. Competent Person Scheme is about the company. But we also have 63,000 skill card holders, which is aligned with CSCS, which is just at the moment a record of your qualifications. And we want to turn that into a record of competencies around those skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. Now, we don't know exactly how we're going to do that. We're waiting for the framework stuff to come through. But we've made that commitment so that we can then evidence, if you're a BISA member, or even if you're not, you can evidence at a competence at a company level and at an individual level. And also members should have a complete record of the body of work that they've done. So they can present that to the Clerk of Works or present that to somebody else and say, here's my evidence that I've got a competent, compliant installation. And you know that I'm not saying it's the Clerk of Works, it's the building control, it's the installer who should own that responsibility. And that's the culture change that we need to engender. Every bit in the chain must own their responsibility for that. In other areas, you'll have heard already, we're doing stuff. We talked about the guide that we did, Passive Fire Protection Guide, but we did that with the FIS, the ASFP and BISRIA. It's a bit about strengthening of those interfaces that Richard was talking about. Where are the gaps and how do we make them together? Or how do we plug those gaps? And we couldn't do that on our own. We needed other trades to help us work out where the interfaces were. We had to launch a BISA Academy during the COVID crisis because A, we couldn't do technical audits and we needed to be able to do those remotely. But secondly, so we can do the CPD that's going to be a requirement. All of this stuff is going to be a requirement, but we're trying to get ahead of it. So we have a diverse membership. We have the majors and we have SMEs, and it wouldn't be a secret to tell you that we haven't taken all our members with us on this yet. Some remain to be convinced because they're waiting for somebody to ask, about raising the bar. But you have to try and inform and persuade, and ultimately, we will have to throw them out if they can't meet the standard. But that's something we will do, but we're going to try really hard to take them with us. Of course, for them, it's really demoralizing when they reach these new standards and they find that they've lost the job to somebody who couldn't do the job, but was at the right price. So the leadership, I guess, also comes from people on the call today, is to say, actually, the thing you can do is to start to demand. I'm sure most of you do already because I'm counting you as the informed, but to require that there is evidence of competence and compliance before they go on the tender list, before you accept their price, not afterwards, because by then it's too late. When I was actually contracting, my favorite client was National Grid, simply because I knew exactly where I stood. The first morning of any project, you had the startup meeting. In the afternoon, commissioning panel chaired by the client, who said, right, tell me exactly what you're going to demonstrate me, exactly everything you're going to give me at the end now, tell me. And that means I knew the commissioning program wasn't going to be given up because of the program. I knew all of this and I had certainty and I could work around certainty. Our members want certainty, they want a level playing field, and you get that through a robust standard. As Dame Judith said in our meeting, the industry should be acting now to rebuild confidence with financial and insurance markets. It's no good us saying premiums have gone up and just member premiums are going up, not just professional indemnity, because they've had a jolly good look at how bad we are at delivering projects that are compliant. Why is it really important? 90% of people spend 90% of their time in the building. If we get it right, we make huge difference, societal impact. We owe people a huge debt because of Grenfell, and therefore there's a moral and ethical obligation on us to do something about it. Thank you.
Great, well, thanks very much, David. Get a quick question for you, really, on the issue of leadership, and that you said that too many people are waiting to be led. And I also took notice of your point about the question of, can you do the job? Well, I mean, there's going to be people out there who will say they can do the job, and I'm sure they can do the job as well. But because of the whole idea of risk aversion, they're not going to stand up and lead. They're going to want to be told by somebody else, just because in terms of risk, that passes the risk on further up the chain. How do you tackle that?
Well, I'm not quite sure that that is a problem. As long as they are compliant and they do deliver compliant buildings, then they would fit within our criteria. They don't have to be the leaders themselves, provided they offer leadership within their own structure. They won't achieve that without being leaders themselves within their own organisations.
I see. All right. Thank you very much. So we're going to move on now to our last speaker, who is Julie Brugella, who is the Technical Director of Assurance at the BRE Group. So Julie, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you for having me. Let me just, can everybody see that? Does that work? Perfect. Yes, thank you so much for this, and it is always great to exchange ideas and be together in events like this to discuss these important subject matters. For me, really just some additional thoughts on two particular aspects. So the interfaces in delivering construction projects and how exactly the Building Safety Bill and the competency framework practically addresses those challenges. And then I wanted to maybe just put a spotlight a little bit on the importance of reporting near misses and incidents in support of industry practices and continuous competency building of our industry. Both of those are very practical spotlights, and I hope they will contribute to our discussion. A short reminder, as many people know, construction has marked complex supply chains and interactions. In a typical project, it's common to have about 50 to 70 tier 2 suppliers, so what we call specialist subcontracting, cladding, building services. Furthermore, most of those projects involve a large number of low-value transactions. So in this particular case study from Bayes in 2013, a typical contract around 15 million in value had about 25% of its tier 2 contractors of values in contracts below £10,000 each. And that really brings with it complex and voluminous information transfer and movement. And again, I've just shown you on this slide some example models. There are many out there in the sphere to sort of that research this particular bit. Our information requirements, our exchanges are vast, the interactions are complex, and the building process can vary and needs to adjust to circumstances, often at short notice. So construction activities inevitably have interactive complexities and are really tightly coupled among systems and players within this and people that have to interact, and a high degree of interdependence between them. And as we so sadly realize, failure can have far-reaching and really potentially catastrophic consequences. Yet the statistics for information capture in construction is really patchy. Anecdotal evidence suggests that a high percentage of our projects have no complete documentation, be it on handover, as built as designed information, or even mandatory health and safety file information, a requirement that has been mandatory since 2015. So how does the draft bill address this? It addresses this actually very directly and builds directly on the recommendations from Dame Judith, who had highlighted this very point really as part of her review. We have really quite distinct phases now of design, construction and occupation. And for each of those stages, we have assigned responsibilities, and we've heard about this a lot today already. But really quite importantly, we have also this golden thread creation, this vital information that is to be gathered and kept over the lifetime of the building. And this is for the very first time a real clear sign of making sure that all of this information makes its way to the building and stays with the building through its life, with distinct and clear responsibilities and assigned key roles for delivering this. We then also have a matching building registration scheme with the building safety regulator that will then issue a building assurance certificate on the completion of this information. And the BSI Flex framework that we have heard about from Richard earlier in section 6.4 also picks this up. And I wanted to highlight this as part of my little overview today, with the core competencies under this knowledge management and communication heading, really about the competence relating to the use, the management, the distribution, and the maintaining and contribution of relevant information, how to obtain it, how to share it, and how to record it. Providing and being aware of informational requirements, as you see in the sub-competence description here, provides a really key additional bit to here. So golden thread information, safety information, and we see here also the introduction of the safety case methodology and new additional information that will have to be now recorded as part of the high-risk buildings records and certification requirements, all of which need to be submitted. This you will have seen in many a path before. It's a well-known risk management visualization tool, but really what it shows is this responsibility of each layer delivering the information through the chain up to the completion of the work, the importance of teamwork, the importance of scrutiny, and the importance of behavior and positive handover from stage to stage through the building. I wanted to use a different example here and maybe share some practical thoughts on how the industry can adopt and change and embrace where we're going next. Construction is very much aligned with conditions and requirements to that of what we call in high reliability organizations. And I wanted to bring to your attention today this work by the HSE, which was published in 2011, about the culture and the approaches, the guidance, as it were, that we see that high reliability organizations are following to deliver high reliability outcomes. And here in particular, I've highlighted in the green boxes, and that will lead me to my sort of final point about near-miss reporting. But really, the anticipation of problems, the preoccupation with failure, and the reluctance to simplify. And really what that means is using incidents and near-misses as indicators of a system's health, a systematic collection and analysis of warning signals, no matter how trivial, and to always look for the systemic rather than the individual failure, coupled with systematic analysis of incidents and root causes and a culture of continuous learning. And when you look to the right of this slide, what we call about a just culture, so the encouragement to report without fear of blame and to move away from blaming, or a culture where there is no open discussion of errors, an open reporting system. And really, that sort of gets me to sort of the final point I wanted to make today and hope to contribute, but is really to alert everybody that in support of the bill and in support of the industry, the confidential reporting system on structural safety is in the process of being expanded. And really a plea to everybody on the call today to familiarize yourself with this great tool, with the way that you can consider and raising incidents that you observe. Browse it, consider to adjust how you process, how you look at being able to report, and to how your employers can contribute to this too, to provide the crucial insights our industry need. And then really watch for updates and learn and incorporate that into industry best practice, not only in the UK, but as you can see here, in other countries where there is really a wide scheme of hub available for sharing and for learning. So really just a couple of practical points from me today to maybe rally some of the discussion that we'll have in a minute. Thank you very much.
Great, well, thanks very much, Julie. If I could ask all our presenters to turn on their cameras and microphones. We've got about 15 minutes now to take some questions in essence. So question came through, it's quite a personal one really, is that the whole issue really about competence. We talked a lot about competence within the industry and the working groups, but what about education? I mean, presumably competence needs to start with education, with training. And my understanding is that the educational institutions sit outside this competence framework. How can we bring them in, fold them in, if you like, to this whole new way of thinking about competence, to make sure that there's a seamless transition really from when you start your training to actually arrive on site?
Thomas, shall I kick off?
Yeah, please do.
Well, I think to some degree they are already involved. So CITB has been involved in a lot of the conversations, a lot of the groups going forward. I think most of the professional organisations are also looking at this very closely and are also involved. And so they're, if you like, re-examining how they bring together the education and match that to the anticipation of where the industry is tending to go. So that's a little bit of the optimistic bit, but I still think absolutely, as we've all said, there's some big challenges around, and this whole thing about trying to drive culture change, it isn't about any one particular bit, it's about, as you rightly say, the whole industry, and that includes education. So we absolutely have got to get the message across to everybody involved in driving training and education at every level in the industry. And I know that quite a few of the higher education establishments who've got an interest in this are focused on it quite intently in terms of how they need to drive the whole of the new agenda, if you like. So I think there is cause for optimism, but there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
David, I think he wants to come in.
Yeah, the industry default position is to say CITB. Of course, whole swathes of the industry are not in scope, and that includes building services. So actually, we don't want to be involved with CITB. We are making our own arrangements. We think actually this is a unique opportunity to do something about the delivery of apprenticeships while we have this blended learning requirement. Then you may as well fundamentally try to change them. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity that we shouldn't miss.
Okay. Andrew, I mean, architects probably have the longest training period of anyone in the industry. And I believe that the RIBA have been talking about sort of having more technical training as part of becoming an architect. But of course, it's all regulated by ARB, not by RIBA. I mean, do you see challenges there?
I think that type of training depends on which university you choose as well, because a lot of the universities are, of course, more art-focused universities, or you can choose one of the more technical-focused universities where you perhaps get that more practical experience and understanding of it. I think the biggest challenge for our profession and the industry at the moment is COVID, and trying to bring students on. You know, the students we've got in the business at the moment, we're trying to encourage people back to the office so that we can mentor them and bring them on. It's very difficult to mentor someone when they're sat at home, when they're a Part 1 student, for example. But of course, those students that came out of university at the end of last summer and are looking for a position at the moment in an office that doesn't really exist, it's going to be very difficult for them to get the relevant experience. And the same is going to be going forward over the next sort of 18 months, who knows, 2 years maybe. So there's a huge gap there in terms of bringing on those young people into the industry.
Well, you come in, Peter. Yeah, I mean, I think it's
and if I just add to Andrew's commentary, the thing that has affected particularly architects for some time is lack of experience on site. And so, you know, even if we get the education establishments and we get the organisations to up their game, we still don't, in my opinion, get enough architects onto site learning practical matters of how construction actually works. But then again, that said, the RIBA will be introducing mandatory health and safety qualification within the next year. So I think that's a good move, and if you like, it's a step ahead of the general trends across the industry.
I mean, Andrew, you made a very good point, really, the whole sort of the issue around COVID and I mean, the whole sort of impact it's having on everybody. I mean, how does the panel sort of see that as impacting on the drive towards, you know, safer buildings and competence?
I'll come in. I think we've got to be really clear-sighted that the stress that is created by COVID on the industry raises risks. We know that competition intensified in 2008. This is a very different event. So rather than say, well, can we push it? Can we force that progress? I think we have to absolutely ensure that we don't back off for 1 second in taking forward the kind of measures that are being discussed, because now is the time where setting a higher bar for these activities is absolutely vital. You know, risk will, I'm afraid, increase over the next couple of years because of the pressures that have come into the market. So we need to go as fast as we can in ensuring that the improvements in competence that we want to see, and in the behavioural change, the culture change that's necessary. We need to push for those probably harder if that's possible, but we certainly mustn't back away from that.
Julie?
Yeah, and I'd also think it is also an opportunity in the way that people access learning, in the way that they can, from their home, have saved some time commuting. I do think with a very well-structured program with really clear ambitions and requirements, people can mold around that. Yes, the practical experience is different, and that will be different for a while. But again, I mean, I've been amazed as to how much of these types of exchanges are possible and how many people can join without having to travel to hubs to be able to do that, and to hear people speak about very important subject matters, and even take courses and pass exams and things like that. So I think there's a huge opportunity there to be exploited.
Thank you. I've got another question here. It's an interesting one. This is really about how they do competence overseas. And Germany was mentioned, and Germany is often held up as an exemplar when it comes to sort of quality, reliability. And I understand in Germany that they have quite a rigorous process for anyone that does anything to do with sort of buildings, or you're a car mechanic or anything like that. There's a training process, and you have a lot of respect in your community as well. I mean, am I right? I mean, are they doing something that we could learn from here in terms of competence and responsibility?
Yes, I think we could. I think they license their companies. And one of the key features of that, interestingly, is you have to pay people properly, which is always a tell. If you're not paying people, why not? Because they either haven't done the job properly or you haven't got the money to pay them. I never understand why we can do all this stuff digitally in BIM, but we can't follow where the payments are, because if you knew somebody hadn't been paid, it would tell you an awful lot. So I guess, yes, but they demand that you're competent to do the job first, then you can set up the company. What are the barriers to entry here?
Very low. And in fact, actually, that I think takes us on to another key theme, is that certainly in the short term, construction's got to cost more, because clearly we need to be putting more resource into every element, into training, into checking, into verification. So the natural result of that is that certainly in the short term we are going to increase costs. What we've got to work out is, can we use things like digitalization to create better productivity, but still maintain higher standards? I think that's the challenge for the industry going forward. But certainly, Thomas, yeah, Germany, we've got a few things to learn. Having said that, I believe from feedback I've got that there is a challenge that you can get quickly over bureaucratic, and you can have projects held up because the right person to sign it off isn't available to sign it off. So it's not all utopia. But that said, there's a lot of things we can learn from Germany. There's a lot of things we can learn from Australia, actually, and a lot of things we can learn from pockets of really good practice all around the world. So I think, again, we need to be aware and feed those into the process.
So before I bring in Julian, I think Simon, you did mention bureaucracy, and I think we had a question about that all this is just going to be more form filling. It's going to be, it's going to cost more, and it's going to be more bureaucratic, and that's a downside. is the panel worried about that? Do you think that is a real risk?
Well, who was it who mentioned the fact that we don't want to turn into an industry which is driving checkers checking the checkers? You know, we already have enough of that in health and safety. There are whole organisations making a good living out of contributing nothing to the industry, and they have done for years. And I think that's a real disappointment. And to me, it's about having a proper and again we mentioned ethics, a proper approach that is ethical but is transparent and verifiable. And we should be using systems, certainly digitally based, which deliver that without this heavyweight bureaucracy.
So thank you. Julie, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, 2 quick points. Just really sort of the in the German system and in others, the protection of the term engineer, you know, which is very clearly associated with a certain level of competence and degree. So that's a real difference. And the requirement for requalification, which I think is sort of very different throughout. And just one other, and that is really about independent checking and you know, this ability to propose work, review work, and really the increasing independence of ensuring review mechanisms, which are not necessarily just with single competency, but a competency of the entire delivery team and its independence in checking each other. So I do think that's a huge potential, maybe more to be captured still.
Thank you. And Simon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that talking to my colleagues all over the world, that they're all going through a very similar process to the Hackett Review. They've all had their own fires, etc. And there's lots of good practice, and I don't think we pool that good practice. And a lot of my colleagues in America, you know, speaking to them, it is all about code compliance. It's a very strict culture over there. You know, nothing gets passed unless it's code compliant. And I think we've got to accept that, unfortunately, if we want to improve standards, that red tape is going to have to be there, and we're going to have to deal with it. And you know, we're going to have to move away from this, you know, reducing red tape, particularly where high risk is concerned.
Thank you. We're nearly out of time, but there's just one last thing I wanted to sort of put to the panel, which is the issue of, I think it was raised, was it by you, Peter, the whole issue around maintenance of older buildings. And it occurred to me that, I mean, buildings last a long time. I mean, they can last 100 years. When you're going to have products and services and all sorts of things in those buildings, where the people that install those products and services and maybe even maintain them, I mean, they just die off. They don't live as long as the buildings. How do we ensure that that body of knowledge for really obsolete products and services maintained as it gets older and older and presumably higher risk?
Yeah, well, I mean, Thomas, I'd say you're absolutely right. I'd say that we've got to have a grip on the performance of the building that is required. You know, after all, we have other systems in society, aircraft, to name one, that have to be maintained to a really high standard. We make the mistake of thinking that complex and large buildings don't have to be maintained to a high standard. Anybody who marches into a building at any point has got to be aware of any performance issue that they might be conflicting with. So for me, the headline there is look, get a grip and focus on what you really should be doing.
Great, well, thank you, Julie.
Well, and again, I mean, I've sort of highlighted that in my talk as well. I think that just the capturing of information, of relevant information, ensuring that is there for people to rely upon, to be able to look, to understand. And again, that's laid out in the new framework, exactly what this information is to contain. And to just keep watching it. Where it doesn't happen, we need to know so that we can learn and adjust in time.
Great, well, thank you very much. Andrew, a quick point.
One final point on that. I think we're advocating the creation of Revit 3D models, but of course software moves on faster than building products. Yeah. So you know, we create a 3D model today, it could be obsolete within 10 years. So we can't access that information. So there's another aspect we've got to think about very carefully.
Very true. We need a new word for maintenance, because it gives the impression if you do nothing, you've maintained it in the state it was in before.
I think we need an entirely new attitude towards our built environment, don't we? We need
yeah, you're right.
owners, and that we have to look at them as assets, not sources of income. We've got to think about them differently. I think that's really key.
Great, well, it's a very good point on which to end, I think. So we are out of time, but I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed to our panel, and thanks to our audience as well for listening. And this webinar will be available on demand, I think from tomorrow. So thanks everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.